The problem with building a project bike is, well, that it's a project, and a lot of projects never really have an end. The K100 is a perfect example of that. If you watched the previous video, you know that I went through a lot of different steps along the way as far as coming up with what the final iteration of the bike was. Which in fact wasn't the final iteration. And yeah, so here we are, spring 2024, and we're doing more to the bike, which I'm excited about. Along the way, I'm going to show you some of the fixes that I did on areas where I just could have done a better job. Now, the first thing I'm doing is actually adding a new fan, and this is for sure an upgrade. The stock fan does have a tendency to fail. It's an area where if you're trying to keep a motor like this cool, you probably want to make sure that your fan isn't going to fail on you. As a lot of you might know, the roots of this channel are actually based around woodworking, and woodworking is something that I'm passionate about and something I'm definitely going to get back to in the next couple of videos. So if you do like those kind of projects, make sure you're subscribed because they're coming up. I'm using this angled drill bit attachment by a company called Craig. That is a woodworking tool that had a great use in being able to get out the old fan just because of the funny angle that the screws are at. Went in really well. Watching this video back, I was thinking I could probably have used a socket. The issue was it was Phillips bolts that were holding it in, so I needed to use something specific for that. Fan I'm upgrading to is a lower profile, higher CFM fan. You can actually check out for yourself over at Parts Holland. I'll link all the products that I used in this video so you can go check them out. Motors have progressed a long way since 1986, so you can really see the difference in the slimness of the new fan versus the protruding motor of the old fan. And I could tell that this fan was actually failing. When you twisted the blade, you could actually just kind of feel a kick in the bearing. So it was a good thing I did this when I did. I unpinned the existing connections from the new fan. This was a little bit more challenging than I thought, and it really just had to do with the fact that I was using the wrong tool. But eventually I got it, and silly me, I actually was going to change these connectors anyway, so I did go through that exercise literally for nothing, and I could have just cut those off because I ended up doing it anyway. So good job, Chris. One thing I have done too much of on this bike and other bikes is I haven't been consistent about the kind of connectors that I'm using. I think for the future, I'm only going to stick to one brand or one style of connector when I do any kind of wiring. That way it's just consistent. But on this bike still, there's several different kinds of connectors that I use. Moving forward, I do want to make that a little bit more consistent. It's a minor detail, but in my brain, it's just the little details that make things so much better, as well as make the bike look like it was a little bit more professional of a build. I did drill a hole through my electronics tray, and this little deep burring tool is so clutch, especially before putting in a little rubber grommet, which is where I want to snake some wires through. I had a bunch of wires that I want to clean up. This is literally how it was on the outside of the frame, and this is how it will be once everything's done. Now you see some of the wiring mess over to the left that's running to the Moto Gadget and a couple other spots. I eventually cleaned this up better than it was. Oh, dang it. Also, if you're going to put a hole through the frame to snake wires through, with any kind of connector, make sure that it fits through the hole because you're going to take things apart if you don't. The upgraded fan from Parts Holland just went in so incredibly easy. Without the protruding motor in the back, it just was so much simpler. I did set this video up, so there are chapters on the different things that I did. So I'll do my best not to actually show the series of events in the way that they were done, but more so in sections based on what was actually done. Because I was doing kind of several things at the same time. And one of the little things I did was mount the choke cable in a more permanent location. So this is always just kind of hung at the top of the frame, and I've used it when I've needed to. But it did tuck in really nicely, kind of right at the front of the frame. We'll say one of my dirty little secrets is I did a horrible job of mounting the airbox. The clip that I originally had designed in Fusion and printed had broken more than once. So it's time for a bit of an upgrade, and this was the version that I built, That integrated hardware and a couple other tweaks have made it incredibly strong. A flying brick apparently needs a brick to mount parts, so it's exactly what I designed. I'll make sure to link this below if you are interested in printing it if you're mounting your Airbox in this way. There's just holes in the electronics tray that attach this little brick to the top side of the Airbox, and the Airbox is just mounted with stock holes. Like I said, I did integrate hardware into this. So one of the challenges of mounting it this way was having hardware that I could put from the top and the bottom, but having a little bit more skill, we'll say, in Fusion 360 allowed me to design something a little bit more, we'll say, advanced than the previous version. And if you're wondering, the material I'm using is carbon fiber PETG. This was a way stronger material, and now that I have an upgraded printer, I can print some materials that are a little bit less Mickey Mouse. I am curious to know if someone is interested in purchasing one of these that maybe doesn't have a 3D printer. So let me know in the comments below, and I will make that available maybe as a product on my website that I would 3D print and send out. I do count myself as pretty fortunate because I'm at the point with my channel where I do have several companies that reach out to try and send me products to review. And one of them was Vevor, who wanted to send me a Sandblaster. So this worked out perfectly because I had just gotten into powder coating and I wanted to redo the front and rear brakes. The front brakes, because the front end is off a GSXR, were this like matte black. And then I had already redone the stock brakes in a red. The brakes, when I did them originally, I just sanded and painted over the stock finish, which was something that would have taken me hours to try and either scrape off or to go through with some kind of a sandpaper or grinder and grind off. So this little Sandblaster, very effective, I'll tell you. I did have some issues, which I'll show you in a bit. However, for the way I was using it and for the volume of sandblasting I needed to do, it worked out really well. With any kind of sandblasting, you definitely need an air compressor that can keep up. Doing something large scale, I would not suggest doing this with any kind of a pancake or small home air compressor. I actually use a home air compressor, and in fact, I used two of them. One of them that was broken that I was able to rig up and turn into an auxiliary tank or a reserve. So one air compressor fills up the tank of the second, and then I have a lot larger supply of air. So you can see here just how well this was actually working for a unit that is, a couple $100. I was getting amazing results with this. I will say this though, sandblasting sucks. It was super messy and got all over the place. So I think I will build a cabinet if I continue to do this. I did run into a pretty major issue, which Vevor said they have fixed now, but let me show you. Do you see what happened? The casting actually wore through in that section. The handle was losing air when it wasn't running, which caused the air compressor to continue running. The replacement valve is fairly inexpensive. However, Vevor did also send me a new one, and it was very easy to deal with them in getting a replacement. I think I told them on the Saturday, and by the next Friday, I had the part in hand. I did want to scrape off the logos on the brakes because the front brakes and the rear brakes were different brands. I just wanted to make them more consistent in the look, so super easy to do. And I just sanded them really roughly with the angle grinder, which made really short work of getting off the logos. And then I just hand sanded it with some sandpaper, which made things a lot smoother. And I'll say in the areas where I powder coated, it was actually a lot smoother in those areas too. The sandblasting I did several months ago, so this fast forwards us back to today, where I'm just using a bit of polyester tape to mask off the areas where I don't want any of the powder coating to get into. I did clean all the parts really well. As you can see, I've added plugs to the holes and threads I don't want any powder coating to get into. And if you are interested in powder coating, make sure you're subscribed because I may have built a powder coating oven that will fit a full-size motorcycle frame in. Stay tuned for that, but that video will come out hopefully in the next couple months. Powder coating is something that I'm enjoying. It's a process. for sure, but when you do all the steps properly, when the parts are properly cleaned, one tip that I learned is you preheat and bake the parts prior to blasting. It just helps bake out any oils or any residues that are in the materials or castings. This it's been a lot of fun. And I did this as 2 layers. And the way you do that is you basically start the baking process. You get the parts to flash, which means the powder coating is melted and it's moving around. And then at that point, you can take it out, hit it with another coat, and the finish that you get is unreal. Like, I cannot believe that these are powder coated brakes that I did in my garage. And when I say brakes, I of course mean brake calipers. The GSX-R front brakes went together pretty easily. However, if you are rebuilding these brakes, you have done this front end conversion, there are 2 different size pistons. Make sure that you're using the right size of washers and the right size of pistons inside the brake cylinders. Are they even called pistons? Doesn't matter. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong. That's usually the way it goes on here. I did have someone ask me the other day about the front discs that I have on the K100. They're actually part of the kit that comes from Jack's Garage. If you are ordering their front end conversion, you can order these discs as well. And everything fits just so nicely as one kit. The mounting and putting everything back together, like, I was absolutely floored at how good these looked once I got everything back together. I needed a hand, pun intended, making sure that the brake fluid did not leak all over the place. So I just used these disposable gloves to hold the tips, and I just zip tied the gloves onto the tips of the brake cables. And that way I didn't have to worry about brake fluid leaking everywhere from the master cylinder. It worked perfectly, and I would do that again. It was just such an easy thing to do. This again is another fixing my mistakes. The back brake always worked. I had no issues with it. I did put new pads on it. However, I never did any kind of a rebuild kit on any of the brakes when I originally did the bike. This was just my opportunity to do that. So I got a rebuild kit from Parts Holland, and this just went together really well. It comes with all the washers, and you can see here, I hope it encloses a couple times because there are little O-rings that have to go in just the right place just to make the right seal for fluid being able to transfer from one side to the other of the caliper. I like to call this part of the video, Learn from Chris's Mistakes. The bolts that I'm using, I believe, are an M10 35 millimeter bolt. That's the wrong size for the rear caliper. The reason that is because those bolts, you can almost see the shadow of it, actually press into the disc. And you can only imagine the damage that could have done to the brake disc if I hadn't have realized this. I believe it's an M1030 that I ended up using. Also, you notice I loosened up the caliper just a little bit, so the casings had enough room just to let me squeeze in the pads before I finished putting them in. Moving on to the exhaust. This is not designed to preheat your rear tire. When I installed the right side exhaust, I probably should have trimmed down the heads. And I could have done that on these ones here, but I found some really cool looking ones on Parts Holland, and I felt I needed to get something that we'll say matched a little bit better. Maybe sounded a little bit better. I don't know. What do you usually say when you need to justify money that maybe didn't need to be spent? They just didn't match as well. We'll say that. Okay. Anyways, having these shorter set, but also with this design that matched the rest of the stainless steel parts on the bike that were TIG welded, just a little touch that I loved so much. Now, I did go to the K Parts website to look at the outline of how this actually gets attached. The first time I put this on, I didn't actually get it on properly. So going to their website, I was able to find that. Hey, if you have made it this far in this video, one thing that I actually have done for this build is release some new t-shirt designs. So you can click the link in the description below and check out some of the cool new designs that we have for merch. This is something I haven't really ever promoted too much on this channel, but it's something that is just a really small way that you can get something that is a tangible value that definitely helps me grow. I don't do this full time. This is a hobby. As much as I am passionate about all the projects that I do, this isn't something that, of course, pays the bills. So you buying a t-shirt, buying a hat, whatever it happens to be, really does help support this channel so I can do future projects. Another simple way that you can support the channel, of course, is just to hit that subscribe button. I know, so many YouTubers, when you're watching videos like this, that's what they say, subscribe. And the reality is this is what the YouTube gods need from us. The bigger the following, the bigger the reach. And if this is something you enjoy, this simple gesture of following this channel definitely helps. And then you can see all the fun things that I screw up on, like pulling paint off with tape. For whatever reason, there's a couple spots on the motor where I must not have primed properly, so I touched some of those areas up. I took the opportunity just to redo the lettering on the tires before taking it off the lift. If you watched the first video, I did a bunch of carbon fiber parts, and they just needed a bit of a refresh. The Total Boat epoxy that I used to make these parts didn't get a clear coat on top. I don't know what I was thinking. I finished the parts and I just slapped them back on the bike. I really should have, and I have now, put some sort of a clear coat on them. I cannot believe the difference that this actually made. Now, the epoxy itself does have a nice sheen to it. Any epoxy that is somewhat UV resistant will yellow, and having a clear coat, a varnish, whatever it is, over top is just going to give it a little bit more luster. In these shots, I honestly can't believe, though, just the difference that the clear coat made. And I think I talked about in the previous video as well, just how I mount the battery with the zip ties. I still don't have a better idea. This has just worked so well, so I'm going to roll with it until someone gives me a better idea. With a lot of the mechanical fixes done, it's time to move on to some of the electronics. And the biggest one for me was properly mounting the speedometer. Now this is the first version, and I tried lots of different things to reinforce it, but it just wasn't strong enough, and it has to do with the material. This is PETG, which PETG is strong and designed for outdoor use, but I really had to do a lot of infills to strengthen it the right way. But one thing I also realized that the weak point being the joint, maybe I could use a material that was more flexible. So I went through a couple different iterations of different styles, and these were just test prints out of inexpensive PLA before I landed on the final design, which is made out of PETG carbon fiber. And this is the final design, which worked perfectly, is way stronger than any of the other designs I've ever done, and is available if you want to try downloading it. I'll put a link in the description if you want to check out that print. Some of you will say, Chris, why didn't you cut it out of aluminum or metal once you had the file designed? Well, I tried, but the dimensions were a little off. Learning more about 3D printing, one of the things that I've been shown and that I have experimented with is trying to do as many prints as possible where there's no supports. Support is basically something else that's 3D printed that holds up a piece that is protruding, we'll say, at a funny angle or in a different way off of the build plate of the printer. Bending this was just such an easy way to get the curve that I wanted without having to, print with any supports. And it's just as strong as it would have been if I would have printed it with a bit of a bend. I don't even need, honestly, that big of a bend in this part, so it worked out really well. The bracket's designed to hold a Moto Gadget Chromo Classic speedometer, the Moto Gadget M-Lock, which is an RFID key, and 2 LED lights. And I'll talk about the LED lights in a second and what they're connected to. I used rubber O-rings as well as washers just to hold all the bolts in place. As most of you know, motorbikes tend to vibrate a bit, and bolts do come loose, and I was not prepared to put Loctite in any of the holes. By the way, if you're watching this video and you've made it even further than the last time I said this, then you might see a bit of a sneak peek of what a future project bike might actually be.
You have to be your biggest fan. And
Moving on to the wiring, this is why we took it off the lift. It's just so much easier to work on this from the top down as opposed to trying to reach over my head. I have this fuse box that I had to put a smaller fuse in for something that I'll show you a little bit later on in the video. But the cool thing about these little power units is I am able to have power for certain things. The bike does have some LED lights that glow underneath where the intake manifolds are, as well as like a couple other little pieces that I've added to it, which I'll show you a little bit later on in the video. Have you ever seen those photos of the people that wire things so perfectly? All the wires are laying flat and everything is color-coded properly and it just looks really neat and tidy. That's not me. However, this is a lot better than it was when I first put the bike together. This being the third, maybe the fourth version of the bike. There's wiring that keeps getting cleaned up more and more and more as I go back into the bike. I think on the next bike, I will spend way more time on making sure the wiring is as neat and clean as possible. Not to, say a show bike level, but definitely to a level where I don't get wires mixed up, and the dreaded green tape for wiring marking doesn't get mixed up because you can't see it in this shot, nor should you, but seconds later, I cut all the wires off and I forget what is what. So I had to go back and fix this, but I also blew a fuse in the process, which made diagnosing this a bit of a nightmare. I did want to show how I wired in the fuel level sensor, but this was the horrible angle that I got. So let's go over what all the wiring is and what it does. There are only 4 wires that go into the fuel tank. There's the ground wire that goes to the fuel pump positive, which of course powers the fuel pump. There's a fuel signal wire, which in this application we're not using. If you did have a fuel gauge, you definitely would want to use that wire. And finally, the low fuel light, which we will be using in this application. This is running an LED light, so all we really need is ground and power. The power is coming from a wire that I had set up connected to the little fuse box, and the fuel level float when it goes down too far. The white wire triggers the ground, which turns on the LED light. My sender, well, it was a little worse for wear. I have a new one coming from Parts Holland, but I can't really demonstrate this. So let me show you just so you can see the LED running. And as you can see, the LED comes on whenever the ground is triggered, which it's always triggered based on the fact that the wire's broken and just grounded out on the actual tank. The second LED light I have here that's wired in is typically a signal that comes off of the alternator that indicates when the alternator is working and the battery is charging. So that will illuminate white when I'm riding and the battery is charging. I like gadgets, and this is one of the fun new ones I got to put on the bike. A company called Carpuride reached out and offered to send me one of their moto versions of their GPS Apple CarPlay devices to review. Now, I had some challenges with this, and I'll be honest, the biggest one was mounting. I actually designed my own mount because I didn't like the bulky mount that it came with. I guess that's a minor thing to complain about with a device like this. For me, this is one thing that aesthetically I had to make sure was in the right spot. I designed this little ball that mounts in the apple tree, and this was just a lot more aesthetically and balanced look compared to the arm that it came with. And I went through a few iterations of this to get it just right, finally landing on my design, which again, I can throw that below. As you can see, this mounts the Apple CarPlay unit center on the dash, which I way prefer than having the big arm. I bet you the arm that it comes with would be great on an adventure bike. On this cafe bike, that is not the look that I was going for. I do have some feedback on this, and kind of at the same time as having this set up and experimenting with it, I was texting with a buddy on the other side of Canada who had recently gotten the exact same device himself. And with his own money, I'll jump to his thoughts in a second, but I'll tell you, being an iPhone user, this is something that I absolutely love. It's just a familiar interface that works the way I would expect it to, and operates how all my other devices would. I also printed a shorter arm for the mounting. However, the arm that it came with was a lot stronger, so I have gone back to it since. I find my gloves do work on the screen well right. As I'm doing the voiceover, Judd just got back from a few-day moto trip around Southern Ontario. He used the device the whole trip, and he had some great feedback about it, some thoughts. He really enjoyed using it. There was a couple things in regards to the mounting that he had some difficulties with. There's a screw in the back of the ball mount that can come loose, so make sure you tighten that. Something definitely to watch out for. So I wouldn't have to worry about this. I put a bit of Loctite on the back of the screw. I can't see ever taking this bolt out, so I wasn't too worried about the Loctite gumming up the threads for future use. The other beef I have with the device is not really something that Carpuride has caused. There's actually no support for any sort of speedometer, tachometer, or any sort of an app that would give you kind of the vitals, so to speak, of the motorcycle. Maybe someone can develop something that incorporates the Moto Gadget and will run off the information that it's feeding to it. But I was also told to try an app called Waze, which I have been, and it's been working fairly well as a GPS that has a built-in digital speedometer. The brass tacks for me in any review is, would I spend my own money on it? I would. Based on my experience so far with it, it's been really good. I got to work on the mounting a little bit better, but that might just have to be more with my bike. Thanks again for Carpuride for sending me their device to try out, and I'll add some links below so you can check out some of the other offerings that they have. We are now in the home stretch, and that is fixing the motorcycle tank. I'll tell you a story. The day that I got this bike together for the first time, it fell over on its side. BMWs have a weird kickstand clutch mechanism that I did not adjust properly. Bike fell over, and you can see the dent that ended up in the tank as the bike fell. I'm using this Total Strip from Total Boat. It's a paint stripper that works amazingly well. Even for someone that's impatient like me, I should have done two things to start this out. By the way, the reason why these shots look really hazy is because there's so much smoke in the air. This was happening during some of the forest fires that we saw earlier in the spring. So of course there was a lot of smoke in the air, and it's just this eerie haze that happens. Two things I should have done better. Number one, I really should have rough sanded the clear coat, because the clear coat that was on the bike was a 2K clear coat, which epoxy style of clear coat that was pretty thick. I could have roughed it up a bit. I also could have been more patient. I could have left this for more than just a day. I ended up sanding off some of it just because I was really trying to get this painted within a certain time frame. My wife was away for the weekend, so I had time to work, so I worked as much as I could during that time. After some of the body filling, I went at it with the paint, and I was really enthralled in this by the looks of it. Didn't get a lot of great shots of this other than me running out of paint here, as you can see. But I did go out, get a couple more cans the next day, and finish the white before doing what I'm doing here, which is coat of that 2K clear. Now, if you've used the 2K clear before, you know the results that you can get at home. You need to polish though, and I'll get to that in the next step. But my goodness, this does such a good job of building up a clear coat. And it's a two-part epoxy style paint, so you have to activate it, and you got about 48 hours to work with it. I went through an entire can on the tank as well as the front fender, so that didn't matter as much for me. For polishing, I went over it quickly with 600 grit and then moved to these pads from Mirka, which are a soft pad that I used a 1000 grit, 2000, and then 3000 grit. To make sure I wasn't sanding any of the clear coat, I did wipe it down with just some water and some paper towel in between each grit. This is just a way that you're not actually going to carry any particulate between each of your sandings. I have used this system before on other projects, tabletops, those kind of things, and it works really well. Once I had everything up to 3000 grit, I did slap on one of the foam pads so I could work in some of the Polar Shine. This is a polishing compound that Mirka also sells. You work this in with the pad in the same kind of way you would if you were waxing or polishing a car. Really, that is what I'm doing. Once I got this all worked in, I let it sit just for a little bit just so it could haze up. And then I came back with buffing pad and just gave the bike a nice little buff. And I truly have never done a paint finish that has looked this good. I've thought for a while that the bike does need a little bit of a pop of color. I had bought this roll of M Performance graphic. It's just a 3M decal that is, I think I even got it from Amazon. I thought this would just be a good way to add a bit of a pop of color. And this was a little bit more challenging than I thought it would be to put on. What you're watching is my first attempt. I've done a second attempt, and I'm probably going to get a buddy who does this professionally to do the final third attempt. Putting the logos back on was a huge milestone, and these are actually BMW logos that I got from K Parts. This just felt so good to get the tank to this spot. I love the fact that the light's actually bouncing off the tank. It's not perfect. There are some flaws, but I can't even tell you how excited I am about how the bike is looking, how it's come together, and the fact that, number one, I own it. Number two, I built it. We'll see if this is the final version of the bike, but for now, I'm just going to enjoy riding it. It always takes a long time to get enough footage together for a video like this. A lot of the work that you saw has taken place more or less over the first half of 2024 and a little bit of the winter of 2023. I have several other bike projects that I've, started, and you'll see those if you're subscribed in future videos. If you have questions, feel free to ask those below. I do try to answer as many relevant comments as I can, and I definitely appreciate the engagement. If you haven't subscribed already, I'd love to see you do that. Again, it does help the channel. I've also included all the parts and some of the tools that I use on this build. Here's a couple other videos if you'd like to check out some of the other work I've done. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next build.